Welcome back to the Stage 18 podcast, your number one source for coronavirus conspiracy theories. Just kidding, but buckle up because we're about to talk about movies.
You know, I feel like before we do that, we need to clear the air a bit on something. Because I've had a friend say that they can't listen to the podcast because they haven't watched all of the movies that we've talked about. It's funny because the same friend who refuses to listen asked me, hey, should I watch Lighthouse? And I just sighed because you as a listener, you know, but let's go ahead and clear this up. So just in case you come across, other individuals out there who you've recommended the podcast to, here's what you can say. So we're just two idiots watching movies, right? Why should you listen to us? Because we're putting in the time to watch these movies so that you don't have to.
Well, you're making it seem like a prison sentence. It's not like a miserable experience watching movies.
Yeah, no, I agree. Some are pretty bad, but we'll get to those in a second. But my point is we make this podcast for people who probably won't watch most of these movies or don't know if they should watch them. So if you haven't seen them, you are the perfect person to listen.
And having said that, don't forget, after you do watch one of these movies, come back and watch the podcast because that makes it like 10 times better.
We try to be careful about major spoilers, but we also want to be able to give you a sense of what we liked and what we don't like from two very different perspectives.
I totally agree with you on that, Cody. You have my reasonable and reliable perspective, very consistent, and then also you get to hear the perspective of somebody who only likes movies from when they were still calling them talkies.
Well, and don't forget there are some great silent films, too.
There probably are. But anyways, Cody, yeah, you should have explained that to your friend in that situation. The way I see it is there's two ways you go into watching a movie. The first is when you hear about a movie, whether it's been recommended to you or you see a trailer that's piqued your interest. You have the film in mind before going into it. The second is when you want to watch a movie on a weeknight or, a boring quarantine night or something. And once that desire to watch a movie has been established, from there you need to find a movie. We all know that searching for a movie right before you watch one can go horribly wrong and cause panic. But now that you have the Stage 18 podcast and you've heard movies that me and Cody have talked about, then you can draw on those. Maybe it's one of our recommendations like Good Time or Amadeus, or maybe it's one of the somewhat under the radar movies we've talked about like Midsummer or I Am Mother. Sure, you might have to pay $4 to rent it, but hey, you got a movie now.
That's right. And speaking of paying to rent a movie, we do have a bit of news on our favorite topic. And no, I don't mean Robert Pattinson's career arc and not the Bechdel test. This whole idea of releasing movies that are in theaters on video on demand at the same time for an increased price. We can't get enough of talking about this topic, and now is the time because we have a major movie chain at this point beefing with a major studio over this very issue.
Yeah, you know me, Cody. I'm a movie theater guy. I love going to the movie theater, but this is your dream come true, straight to streaming.
And due to the massive success of Trolls World Tour being released on video on demand by Universal, they've actually announced that they'll be considering more parallel releases even after theaters are back open. So we called it, right? Movie theater chains are not happy about this, as we discussed in a previous episode, for two reasons. Number one, they don't get their profits when sold directly to the consumer. So the studio gets the profits in whatever the platform is. And then number two is movie theaters' main moneymaker is not actually the ticket sales. They only get a small percentage of those. It's the concessions. Why is a bag of popcorn $20 at the movie theater? Because that's what's paying for those reclining seats and surround sound and all the other good stuff that goes along with watching a movie in a theater. So AMC has announced that they will boycott Universal Pictures if they do decide to go ahead with this parallel release strategy.
Well, AMC, I think they might be boycotting everything if they go out of business.
But Universal isn't exactly cash flush either. This boycott could put in danger the DreamWorks animation films like Shrek, if they decide to make another one of those. Jordan Peele's new Candyman reboot, the Purge franchise, and their largest franchise of all for Universal, which is Jurassic World. So, Zach, what do you think about these two titans kind of playing chicken over this video on demand issue?
Honestly, I'm a little torn on this issue. My cognitive dissonance is telling me that the natural order of things must be when a new movie comes out, you see it in the theater. You're part of a public audience on a Friday or Saturday night, and you buy popcorn and justify drinking a large soda. It borders on ritualistic almost. But also, let's be real about the situation. All that's happening is somebody's making a movie and somebody's watching it. I don't see why anything needs to get in the way of that. Now that I actually think about it more, it's kind of a scam having to go to a movie theater. Movie theaters are just someone saying, hey, somebody made a movie. You can watch this movie, but only at the places that we choose and only at the times we choose. If you're watching the movie and you get hungry, get prepared to pay more for popcorn than its weight in gold.
Right. I do like watching event movies, like the Avengers and things like that, or even like horror movies with an audience. I think it adds that extra dimension when you hear the gasps and the applause and stuff like that. It goes along with the movie.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of the movie when I saw Hereditary, that movie by the same director as Midsommar. I remember there was some lady sitting close to me, and I thought she was just going to have a panic attack from fear. And when I think about that movie, I honestly think about that experience. So, yeah, I'm still with you a little bit on the public experience. But still, back to the existence of movie theaters. Movie theaters made sense for a long time, like ancient Greece through Shakespearean days. The theater was pretty necessary. Even when the filmed movie was first invented. Those projectors and film reels were all like new technology and not really practical for mass production. So I get the need to show movies in theaters then. However, since the VCR came out, going to a movie theater for the purpose of just watching a movie is almost kind of just a luxury now. I hear everybody, oh, but the screen is so much better and the sound. Some of the best movie experiences I've had have been on laptops or on airplanes.
That's a good point. And I like the idea of the theater being an option still, but not the only option. This whole AMC boycotting thing. It feels like Barnes & Noble boycotting book publishers, for putting out ebooks. It's just crazy. They're fighting against the tide of history. The movie theaters, they're fighting a losing battle, and they're going to need to adapt or die, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with that. And another dimension to this is right now, don't you think that currently there's a status aspect about appearing in theaters? Like calling a movie a Netflix movie is still kind of an insult, but knowing that a movie was in theaters at one point kind of reassures you to take it seriously. Is that status just going to disappear the moment I pay $25 to watch the new Top Gun movie the day it's released at home?
I agree. I think there is a certain mystique to it. But again, if I go back to the book analogy, it's like seeing a book on a bookshelf in a bookstore. It reminds you that it's out. It's kind of cool. You can pick it up and flip through it and things like that. And I think the same is true for the movie theater. There's a reason why, in order to be eligible for an Oscar, your film has to play in theaters.
But let's say that all Universal films and all Disney movies start going straight to streaming. Maybe kind of the plus side of that happening is that's going to clear the way. If there's no Pixar and Marvel movies hogging all the screens, then these struggling filmmakers, who are just, sweating to get their movie played at a small festival, maybe we'll get to see more of those in our main movie theaters around town.
Yeah, it certainly levels the playing field a bit. If your smaller movies available on the same platform as some of these big tentpole movies that would usually get a huge distribution. Speaking of which, Speaking of large distributions, movies playing in theaters, there were a few bigger movies that came out over our break between seasons that we missed talking about, but we really wanted to give our thoughts.
All right, so our first movie we're going to discuss today is 1917. It's a newish movie. It came out in theaters. I miss movie theaters, by the way. It came out in movie theaters last December. It's a war movie from Sam Mendes, who has made a lot of good movies, such as American Beauty and the good Daniel Craig Bond movies, not Quantum of Solace, but the other good ones. Working with Mendes is some cinematographer who's like good at pushing play on the camera or something. Who is this guy who did the cinematography for 1917?
Yeah, Roger Deakins. He is hands down the best director of photography in the business. He's been nominated for 15 Academy Awards, and for a while he wasn't winning any, and people were getting mad, kind of like a Leo situation. But to date, he's taken home 2, including one for the film we're about to discuss. He is the Steven Spielberg, the Leo DiCaprio, the Beatles of cinematography. Some of my favorites are Blade Runner 2049, for which he took home an Oscar, Sicario, for which he should have won an Oscar, Skyfall, and No Country for Old Men. All of which, every frame is just amazing to look at, and 1917 certainly follows suit in that regard.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in camera work or lighting, and honestly, when people talk about those aspects of a film, they're like, "Oh, did you see the angle of that shot?" I'm just like, I wasn't really thinking about that, but I totally agree though. Roger Deakins is amazing, and all of his movies, I don't know how he does it, but like everything just looks so huge and everything looks so clean and crisp.
And this is a great setting for it. World War I, we follow 2 British soldiers on their mission to deliver a message to a battalion of soldiers deep in enemy German territory, to warn them that the Germans are about to ambush them.
They're walking into a trap. Your orders are to deliver a message calling off tomorrow morning's attack. If you fail, it will be a massacre.
I was disappointed in this movie, but before we get to that, go ahead, Zach. What did you think?
I was honestly pretty hyped for watching this movie. Once I heard it was being made, I love war movies. I love war history. So I was very glad to see a movie about World War I. You know, it's a nice change from the onslaught of World War II movies we get. You know, whether it was my U.S. history class in high school or a podcast I listened to, you know, people always talk about the harsh conditions the soldiers went through in World War I. You know, trench warfare, soldiers hiding in the same spot under piles of dirt for months at a time, rain soaking all their clothes, getting gangrene, rats everywhere, and hoping a massive artillery shell doesn't just land and explode on them. I would say that 1917 definitely delivered at showing what that was like. You felt like you were with these Brits, you know, carrying all the heavy gear and looking out for enemies. There was a conversation early in the movie where a character was talking about how hungry he was, and that made me think, like, you know, I flip out if I don't have popcorn when I watch a movie, and this guy has to fight in a war on an empty stomach. Another moment from 1917 that stood out to me was when the British soldiers were walking out of a mine that the Germans had integrated into their trench, and they're walking out of this mine, and you see behind them just massive piles of artillery shells, and think like, wow, like they're shooting those at each other. You know, as far as a visual experience goes, 1917 was top notch.
Yeah, so I'm going to disagree with you a bit on everything, except that. About 30 minutes in, I was a little miffed, and I thought, you know what? I'm just going to come out and say it. I think this movie kind of sucks. They do this thing where they try to do the entire film as like one long interrupted shot with a heavy CGI assist to kind of blend all the takes together. And I give them points for being bold and trying something that crazy, but it really just feels like a gimmick. Although the camera work is excellent and it does succeed in building the tension, the kind of long interrupted shot, we spend lots of time just behind our main character watching him walk. if the filmmakers wanted us to see something in the shot, they need to actually move the camera, which is much more disorienting than a cut. Sometimes it felt like I was watching gameplay from a third-person video game. And there isn't as much like characterization in the two leads of the first act. They're just kind of randos. We don't really get to know them, and the only inner conflict they face is just not wanting to die, which is enough, but I don't know, kind of boring to me.
Yeah, I can actually totally see that. And on that point, I feel like 1917 took the same route as Dunkirk, Christopher Nolan's World War II war movie. They're both extremely narrow focused, and they don't get into the geopolitics of the situation, and they don't get into the big picture of what's going on really at all. Everything beyond what was directly in front of these two soldiers in 1917 felt just kind of generic, Like overall, like the movie was really cool, but I definitely felt like I was wanting something more after seeing it.
It's funny you mentioned Dunkirk because the sense I got was it wants to be Dunkirk so badly. But I think the difference is the Germans, the enemy, never really felt like a genuine threat like in Dunkirk. In that film, they're this like unrelenting, omnipresent menace that's always just like a step away. In this film, they're sort of sparse and a bumbling few who just can't even shoot straight.
Okay, I see your point about the Germans not being as threatening. But you have to remember, Cody, that Dunkirk is World War II and 1917 is World War I. These events are taking place decades apart from each other. Obviously, in World War II, the tactical warfare is going to be more advanced than in World War I. Did you think about that?
That's a good point. I still think that it doesn't really address my complaint of the enemy never really felt like a really big threat. And I mean, just besides that, like the only interesting performances I thought were the cameos from Colin Firth and Benedict Cumberbatch.
No, Major, hesitate now, we lose. Victory's only 500 yards away.
Sir, please read the letter.
I have heard it all before.
But they're so fleeting that we never really even got to know them. And of course, we talked about it already. The cinematography is stunning. It's the main redeemable quality of this film. It's always just gorgeous to look at. But I think that's also part of the problem for me. War isn't beautiful. It's ugly. The production designers and Roger Deakins somehow managed to make even like dead bodies and the carnage of war look aesthetically pleasing.
Maybe that's just you, and we should be keeping an eye on you from now on if you would like to look at that stuff.
No, I would never I couldn't. I would never murder anybody. What? No, but overall, what do you think?
Overall, this is a solid war movie. I definitely recommend it, especially to war movie fans. And I, just to compare it to Dunkirk, I thought it was a little bit better than Dunkirk. If I had to give it a score, 8 out of 10.
Yeah, and I didn't really care about the characters, and I was pretty bored throughout. Again, some of this stuff was just not really necessary. I give it a 6 out of 10, but all of those 6 are just for the visual experience that it is. All right, so let's move on to another period piece. We have a couple of those this episode. And this was another film that came out recently. And this is an odd one for us. I don't think we've reviewed a romance film yet in the podcast, but first time for everything. So this film ended up on our radar because it started to get some buzz at the Cannes Film Festival, where it won Best Screenplay, and it currently boasts a 98% on Rotten Tomatoes. So we thought we'd check it out. We're talking about, you guessed it, the French historical romance Portrait of a Lady on Fire.
Yeah, Portrait of a Lady on Fire. It's about a French painter in the late 18th century. She's tasked with making a portrait of a woman from a wealthy French family who's about to be married off to a man her family has chosen for her. Not only were arranged marriages common in France at this time, but I guess that the pre-marriage portrait was like a normal, customary thing to do then. Anyways, though, the woman who's being painted, she's very reluctant to go through with the marriage, and yeah, she doesn't want to be painted at all either. So our main character, the painter, she must observe this bride to be during the day and then try to paint her by memory at night. Like you said, it's a romance movie, so things get flirty between the two, and the film follows how that plays out.
And let's get into kind of what we liked. So the production design and the costumes were beautiful. It was very good use of color and somehow avoided feeling old, like a lot of these movies can feel like. It felt like a modern film, sort of. I'd imagine there was some color correction going on, but to me it almost looked like a painting. And at times it reminded me of the martial arts film Hero with its use of like vibrant color.
Amazing movie.
Yeah. This film is about an artist, and the art in the film is beautiful. I thought it blended with the real world very well. I love like 18th century portraits, and this features some great ones. Also, it had some fascinating characters. I thought the relationship between the family and the artist was good. Everyone has like interesting inner conflict, and each one of them feels sort of trapped in their own way. Even there's a young supporting character who's a maid, has an interesting backstory and characterization. Like I Am Mother, this film is almost without a single male, and it definitely passes the Bechdel test.
Yeah, we got another movie passing the Bechdel test.
Much to our good friend Zach's chagrin, I would add. But I also thought the dialogue was great, especially between our two leads, and it does a great job of kind of giving you exposition without giving you exposition. So they're not just spitting it at you in your face. It kind of comes up naturally throughout the course of conversation. And you see their relationship evolve over the course of the film, and I think that keeps it interesting. And all of that, of course, is possible due to the acting, which was top-notch from everyone. I also thought the story was novel, and it was fun to see where it would go next for me.
I'm not a scholar of 1700s French culture, but everything about the movie, Portrait of a Lady on Fire, it just felt real. As you watch, you're not thinking, oh, the crew did a great job of designing this set, but rather you think like, oh, that's what it was like back then. One example of a specific glimpse into the past that we get to see through this movie was that the characters, they live in a coastal town in France, a place that I would be thrilled to visit. It's beautiful and the house is awesome. But the characters spoke about how boring their life is. They're in this beautiful mansion on the beach. They're talking about how boring it is compared to their trips to Milan in Italy. I like the context conversations like that provided. Additionally, whenever there's a movie that you see a character do their craft, it always seems to be satisfying. I guess, if it's done well. In this case, we have a painter, and it's great to watch her paint. And for some reason, like the brush strokes as she paints sound so good. Like I think honestly I could listen to those brush strokes all day. I'm actually after this I'm going to try to look for some audio of that and just listen to it maybe. Maybe not though.
Yeah, it was a good companion to the sound of the beach that's right outside their window. I thought the brush strokes and the sound of the ocean meshed really well. All right, so what we didn't like, it was a little slow for my liking at times. It's a romance, so that's to be expected. It's not too bad, but sometimes I'm like, okay, guys, we've milked all we can out of this moment. The characters kind of stare longingly at each other throughout much of the movie, and I'm just like, okay, just go for it already, guys. Also, everybody whispers everything. It's kind of weird. It's like, why are you whispering? You're alone. You don't need to whisper. Also, like Good Time, my complaint about that movie, there's too many close shots from the shoulders up. You have a beautiful set in a beautiful setting. Pull back a little bit and show it to me. I get that they're trying to keep it intimate feeling, but it was just felt claustrophobic. You don't have to go fisheye like the favorite, but maybe once in a while cut to a wide. That's all I ask.
Yeah, speaking on stuff we didn't like, overall, Portrait of a Lady on Fire is not my type of movie. And I don't mean because it's a romance movie. but because it's a boring movie. I heard someone, actually it was director Brad Bird, great director. He said a movie is like waiting for a meal at a restaurant. In that sense, like the payoff of the movie is your food arriving. He then went on to say that a great movie is like that, but it also makes you forget that you are hungry and waiting for your food the whole time. If I had to compare Portrait of a Lady on Fire to a restaurant experience, I think it would be like waiting 2 hours for your meal, and then when they finally bring the meal to you, you find out the food is cold. I can appreciate a lot of the visual aspects to it. No complaints with the acting, and there's some good characters in it, like you mentioned. But I felt like there was just so much air, and I agree. At some points, you just want something to happen. I don't like the it's not for everyone defense. To me, when you say it's not for everyone, like I just imagine a bunch of like preppy NYU film students liking it and nobody else liking it. I get that Portrait of a Lady on Fire has a lot of important themes, but you got to engage me more than just showing people silently looking at each other, or maybe somebody carrying a pail of water through some hallways for what felt like half the movie.
I can see that. Yeah, I kind of agree with all of that. Overall, though, I'd say it was a beautiful film with a compelling enough story and characters and performances to forgive some of the slowness. I'd say 7 out of 10. If you like romances or period pieces, definitely check it out.
I'm going to go with a 4 out of 10. It's definitely not this should have gone straight to Blu-ray 4 out of 10, but more of like, I'm kind of mad I wasted 2 hours, 4 out of 10.
Gotcha. It's like a 45 years 4 out of 10, where it's a good movie. You're just mad that it doesn't have action or anything like that.
I guess so, yeah. But anyways, France, thank you for making a movie. Now let's go check on Spain. That's where our next movie we'll be discussing comes from. This movie is called The Platform. And in our last episode of the Stage 18 podcast, we talked about the movie Circle. And we got a lot of feedback about it. And this has led to a lot of conversation about these scenario sci-fi movies. If you remember Circle, it's just a bunch of people trapped in a room for 2 hours and they're all dying. This is kind of like that, where it's kind of like one place, everything revolves around it. We both decided to give another one of these weird sci-fi movies a shot. And this one has been getting some buzz lately. It's called, The Platform. And like I said, it's a Spanish film, which definitely qualifies for this scenario sci-fi category. I've even heard The Platform referred to as vertical Snowpiercer, which I think is pretty accurate in a way.
Oh, okay. I can see that. This is a Netflix film, so one wouldn't be blamed for being a bit weary going in. But don't worry, it's more in the I Am Mother category than the Break category.
Definitely.
As far as quality is concerned. It stars 2 comedic actors whose names I will not butcher here, but they are almost cast against type, and it gives it an interesting vibe. But before we get into what we thought, let's start out with the premise.
All right, so in The Platform, there's a dude. He's in a prison where the prison cells are stacked on top of each other, 2 inmates per cell. For the prisoners to eat, food is piled onto a table or, a platform, and that table goes from the top of the prison to the bottom, stopping on each level briefly once a day for the prisoners to eat. Then it goes down to the next floor. As you can imagine, after enough floors, there's nothing but scraps left on the table. If there's no food left on the table, the prisoners are out of luck. So things get crazy for the inmates who are on the lower floors. You learn alongside the main character the rules of the prison. For example, our main character tries to grab food from the table to save for later. And then he learns that if he does that, his cell will either turn into a furnace or a freezer unless he throws it back on the platform, once it's going down to the next level. So let's start out with the things we liked about The Platform. I liked it. It felt like it kind of had the essence of a movie like Circle. It's a completely ridiculous scenario, but it did a lot of things right that allowed you to keep taking it seriously. For example, this prison makes zero sense to exist at all, but you also get glimpses of the outside world, and it creates a whole universe for the movie.
For sure. Despite being obviously low budget, the film feels huge. And unlike Circle, the film had a compelling narrative to me. The premise is excellent, but it doesn't just stop there. Like, it's obviously an allegory, exploring themes like greed, fairness, wealth redistribution, themes that hit a little bit differently with this pandemic situation. You know, we see people hoarding toilet paper in the real world instead of just taking what they need, and this film definitely speaks to that.
Yes, very like culturally timely at the moment. The prison is a metaphor for society and scarcity of resources, but it's blended nicely in the story and it never gets preachy or anything about that. One character, she makes it her goal for everyone in the prison to eat a small enough portion so that, everybody on each level has a chance to eat. But she finds out that this is much easier said than done. And it really does get you thinking about society, and it makes you wonder about the ethics of survival and, whether individuals are to blame or the system itself is to blame.
And like you were getting at, it explores the idea of like even a messiah who tries to cure the ills of the system, and it just doesn't work out for them. The system has to change from the top down, literally in this case, but, metaphorically in our world, I think is what they're getting at. But it does so many things super well. Like, the dialogue is great. The conversation, especially between the two leads in the first act, it keeps you engaged at the very beginning. And despite being stuck in what is essentially a single room the whole time, they had my attention from the beginning and they didn't lose it. So it was also great when their relationship became a little more strained as the food ran out. And it was interesting to see the main character's kind of different relationships with each of his cellmates. I liked how the main character's altruism was rewarded as well. He was kind to a lady who was looking for her son, and then later she comes back and saves his life. So I liked that karma kind of came back to bite the evil people and rewarded the good in some sense.
Yeah, I feel like every character in the platform was great. The way they've learned to adapt in the prison, how they react to not getting enough food, how they try to change things in the prison. Everybody has a mission or a secret. Sometimes it's insidious, sometimes it's noble, and you kind of play the detective as to figure out, who's doing what and what their intentions are, while you're watching.
So we both obviously liked this movie, but Zak's favorite phrase, it's not for everyone. Sometimes the gross out stuff seemed a little bit like it was just for shock value. One scene in particular, when a dude is trying to climb a rope up to the next level, and the people above him do something really gross. I don't know if my mom would be able to make it past that moment, but I think that was the only thing I didn't really like about it.
Yeah, I honestly love this movie. I would give it a 9 out of 10. I liked it so much that, I watched this a couple days before you did, Cody. I remember those like 3 days before you had watched it. I was just like so envious of you that you still got to watch it for the first time. So 9 out of 10. If you like sci-fi, it's like, this is awesome.
Very high praise there, Zak. Overall, I also really like this film. It was able to do so much with just a few characters and a minimal set. Great performances overall, and a creative, allegorical story kept me engaged. I think some of the gross out stuff it prevents it from being in 9 or above territory, but I would give this film a solid 8 out of 10 and would recommend watching it if you have a strong stomach. All right, so next up, we're going to get to everybody's favorite segment. Zak, can you tell us a little bit about how recommendations work?
All right, so each episode of the Stage 18 podcast, I'll recommend a movie for Cody to watch, and then Cody will recommend a movie for me to watch. And then the following episode, we'll have both watch that movie, and then we'll both discuss it and give our thoughts. Sometimes Cody's movies, you just got to suffer through them. And Cody's really lucky, to be able to watch the movies I recommend. And that's just something we have to live with. So this time around, last episode, Cody recommended that I watch Tigers Are Not Afraid. Cody, could you give us an overview of what this movie you recommended is?
Tigers Are Not Afraid is a 2017 Mexican crime fantasy thriller with some horror elements. And I knew that Zach likes all of those things, so this was a very calculated recommendation. It's about a small gang of kids living in a cartel-occupied region of Mexico, basically needing to fend for themselves. The main character is a young girl who's played fantastically by Paulo Lara, who I think will end up having quite the career. But her mom dies, and she meets up with the rest of these kids in this gang. And she's given sort of like an initiation task, which is to kill the leader of the local cartel faction in order to kind of join this gang. So it's up for debate whether she succeeds, but her actions set in motion a chain of events where the kids are on the run from the cartel for pretty much the rest of the movie. This is a foreign film. It has action. It has horror, all tailor-made for Zach to love it. But as we know, ever since my Hot Fuzz review, he likes to give my recommendations a 7 out of 10 or lower for some small nitpick that somehow removes 3 points. So, Zach, what do you think?
Okay, first of all, I just won't respond to what you said there. But anyways, you were right actually with recommending Tigers Not Afraid on such a calculated basis. You know, my favorite parts of this movie were the setting, you know, the crime-ridden area of a foreign country. Can't go wrong with that. I was a little hesitant when I realized that our story would revolve around a bunch of kids. You know, I was thinking, oh, this is going to be like Super 8. You know, that J.J. Abrams movie where J.J. just shamelessly tries to, you know, copy-paste the essence of a Spielberg movie like The Goonies. You also see that in shows like Stranger Things where it just sort of feels like E.T. fan fiction. However, these assumptions were not correct. Through some absolutely crazy scenes, these kids in the movie are going through a much darker experience. I think it's more akin to a movie like City of God, you know, the classic 2002 film about the slums of Brazil where children are basically running an entire crime organization. And it just makes you feel, like an idiot forever thinking that your life is tough. And speaking of these crime elements I enjoyed, there was one great scene that stuck with me. You know, the kids, they have a video that could get the cartel leader in trouble because it shows him torturing a woman. At one point, these kids see a police car and they rush up to it and show the officers the video. And then when the officers realize who's in the video, they're just like, is that who I think it is? And immediately hightail it out of there, you know, because they don't want to get involved. It really adds a lot to the universe of the movie and the scope of just the corruption in the world these kids are trying to survive in. But I would say that the sci-fi and horror aspects fell a little short. For example, there's these lines of blood that follow the main character. Like there's like a dead body and then a line of blood from the body will be following the character as they walk away. And the effects are horrible. It just looks cheesy and kind of took me out of it sometimes. You know, I get that it's low budget, but my philosophy is no special effects are better than bad ones. You know, I don't want to be too negative about Tigers Are Not Afraid because, you know, there was also some really well-designed scary aspects of it. You know, overall, though, you know, solid movie. You know, I didn't just like absolutely love it, but I enjoyed it, and I give it a 7.5 out of 10.
So there it is. I'm glad we got an extra 0.5 out of you, and it sounds like you enjoyed the film, other than like the cheesy stuff and visual effects, which is interesting to me coming from someone who recently recommended Circle and Labyrinth, but what can you do? I love this movie because it was never boring, and it depicted the threat of cartel violence better than I think any movie since Sicario, and was interesting to see that through the eyes of kids. But that being said, this is your movie review, and there's no accounting for taste.
Okay.
All right, so I also had a movie to review. Zach, can you tell us about that one?
Barry Lyndon is a movie from 1975 about an Irish middle-class guy. His name is Redmond Barry. And we follow a good chunk of his life as he moves from his average position in the Irish gentry up to the English aristocracy. This dude goes through a lot, including fighting for two different countries in the 7 Years' War, serving as a spy for the Prussian government. He spends time hustling French elites at cards. And all this happens before the intermission. Of course, Barry Lyndon is a Stanley Kubrick movie, so you can trust that every single sound, every single piece of the shot that you're seeing is intentional. I listened to an interview with Stanley Kubrick, and he was talking about how in preparation for this movie, he listened to literally every single piece of recorded music in existence from the 19th century. And also, I guess he was able to swindle his way into getting some cameras that were made by NASA that you couldn't get anywhere else. Yes, this is a 3-hour period piece, but it's the opposite of how boring that sounds. Barry Lyndon isn't the kind of movie that just entertains you. It changes you.
Wow. Yeah, I also really liked it. It's an odd choice for Kubrick. It's unlike any of the films that he's made, before that, which I think shows some range. It almost reminded me of an HBO miniseries with its character-driven plot and just kind of general narrative style. The film is known for its cinematography, and on that, it definitely delivers. This is what I mean by making good use of wide shots. It's also known for using no artificial light, so the scenes at night are using candlelight and fantastically realistic looking. The production design is fantastic. The lavishness of the 18th century wealth is cool to see. Both the costumes and interiors are just on point. If this is your favorite movie, then I see why you loved Amadeus so much. The two films have very similar vibes.
Top three favorite movies.
Okay, sure. There's also so many great side characters that are in just a scene or two. The two lads who offer Lyndon a drink on his way to Dublin and then later rob him, the fellow who his cousin was supposed to marry, the lord who's suspected of being a spy who Barry later ends up helping rig card games. I just love how British it all is. A man is pointing a gun at Barry and he's like, Captain Feeney at your service.
I'm Captain Feeney.
Captain Feeney?
Captain Feeney at your service.
Just still so classy and just British. Barry is a great character too. He has more courage than sense, and you feel for him throughout the film. If there's a duel or a fist fight to be had, he does not shy away from it. But he's also kind of slimy. He has no issues deserting the military, lying about it, comforting other men's wives while their husbands are at war. His character can best be summed up in a great line from the narrator, which is, Barry was born clever enough at gaining fortune, but incapable of keeping one. For the qualities and energies which lead a man to triumph in the former case are often the very cause of his undoing in the latter. It perfectly applies to Barry and this movie overall. I also love movies with a narrator. I don't know why. Maybe it just reminds me of a film noir detective stories, or I don't know. It just makes me feel like I'm in good hands.
Oh, and by the way, yeah, in that same interview with Stanley Kubrick, he said that he uses a narrator to substitute for laborious context building scenes. Basically he does that to kill boredom. So maybe that's another reason why I liked it so much.
Yeah, it definitely works here. What I didn't like, it's a bit meandering at times. I could easily find 45 minutes to an hour to cut out and we wouldn't lose much. I think if it were made today, it might be a better mini-series than a movie. Of course, they didn't do that back then. And it's less of a cohesive narrative than just a collection of great moments. The key to adapting a novel, I think, for the screen is leaving out the bits that aren't needed. And at that, Kubrick doesn't always hit the mark. I think he loved the book too much, so he didn't really want to miss anything. To quote Amadeus, just too many notes.
My dear young man, don't take it too hard. Your work is ingenious. It's quality work. And there are simply too many notes. That's all. Just cut a few and it'll be perfect.
Which few did you have in mind, Majesty?
I did occasionally have trouble getting through it. It took 3 sittings to make it all the way?
Actually, yeah. Upon recommending it, I rewatched it too, and yeah, I also had to do it in multiple settings too, but not because I got bored, but just because I felt like I needed to stop and regroup and fully absorb what I had seen. Kind of like a good steak. You don't want to just stuff it down, but rather you want to take your time and appreciate each bite.
Definitely needs a couple sittings. Overall, though, I think it was a great film. I really, really liked it. Fantastic characters, performances, and cinematography. And I'm comfortable enough in my own masculinity and ego to give it a 8.5 out of 10. It's right up there with Amadeus in terms of quality, and I would highly recommend that everybody watch it.
Finally, a good review for one of my movies. I can't remember the last one. All right. Well, first of all, I'm glad you enjoyed it. It proves that your circle review from last episode may have actually been objective after all and not just a revenge review for 45 years. If I had to knock on Barry Lyndon, my one complaint would be the cinematography is too good. Sometimes I would just get so lost in the scenery, I'd miss dialogue, so I'd have to rewind it, catch what they said. But Cody, how would, this is a Stanley Kubrick film, like we said. How would you compare this to other Stanley Kubrick movies?
That's a good question. I think it's not as cerebral as, The Shining or 2001 or even really Paths of Glory, but it has the same irreverent humor as Dr. Strangelove. And I guess it's technically an epic, with its sprawling narrative and massive set pieces, but it feels smaller than Paths of Glory and 2001 in terms of scope. And that's probably because it just follows that one single character, almost like The Shining in that way. But every one of his films is unique, and this is no exception.
Yeah, definitely. And I would add that out of the Kubrick movies, I think this is one of his more digestible films. If you turn on 2001: A Space Odyssey or a movie like A Clockwork Orange, you just think like, what have I done? You got to kind of white knuckle your way through the first hour of those. Barry Lyndon, for me, like it feels like a simple story at first, and you're able to follow it, and then before you know it, you're just a connoisseur of pre-French Revolutionary European culture.
Yeah, it was cool to see that kind of through the eyes of such a great character. But let's move on to our recommendations for the next episode. Zach, you like to give me guff about enjoying movies made before 2000, and sorry, but this is going to be another one of those. I'm recommending it to you because it's one of the first early films I watched, and so it's to blame for my penchant for films of that era. It's the 1949 classic 12 O'Clock High, starring Gregory Peck. And this is a World War II film, and one of the early examples of kind of post-war cinema. And it sets the stage for films that follow, like another previous recommendation, Paths of Glory, which came out almost a decade later. It deals with the subject of PTSD and themes of following orders no matter what, kind of like Paths of Glory and that kind of thing, so I hope you'll enjoy it.
Sounds good. Cody, my recommendation for you is Tampopo. This is a Japanese Western / food movie that was recommended to me recently, actually by a listener. The only thing I'll say about it is it's basically about making ramen, a food that, I previously enjoyed but I didn't think much of, but now I am absolutely obsessed with ramen.
All right. That sounds good. I don't think I've seen a food Western movie yet, so looking forward to that.
All right. Well, I think that about wraps it up for us. We absolutely appreciate everybody listening and hope that some of the movies we've discussed have piqued your interest, and that we hope that you'll check them out.
Yeah, thanks so much for listening. Keep the feedback coming, and of course, if you get a chance, check out the movies we talked about in this episode or the movies we'll talk about in the next episode.